For 12 years, my world existed within the manicured perimeter of a 4-bedroom colonial house in suburban Denver. Before I married Julian Sterling, I was a senior graphic designer at a boutique marketing firm downtown, earning my own living and managing my own portfolio. But when Julian decided to launch his independent architecture and construction firm, Sterling Designs, he convinced me that my creative eye was needed at home. He painted a rosy picture of teamwork. He would conquer the corporate client space, while I would manage our domestic life, host potential investors, and handle the back-office bookkeeping without taking a formal salary. I poured my heart into that house. I scrubbed the hardwood floors until they reflected the Colorado sunlight, folded his tailor-made suits with surgical precision, cooked 5-course dinners for wealthy developers, and kept our household budget tighter than a drum. Yet, in the eyes of my husband and his mother, I wasn't a partner. I was an unpaid maid who had forgotten how the real world worked. It was a chilly Tuesday afternoon in October when Victoria, my mother-in-law, arrived unannounced. She swept into my immaculate kitchen, wearing a pristine cream cashmere coat, smelling of expensive French perfume and subtle condescension. She didn't offer a hug or even a polite greeting. Instead, she ran a gloved finger along the top of my marble island, searching for imaginary dust. "Audrey, dear," Victoria said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth as she draped her coat over a dining chair. "Julian looks exhausted lately. The poor boy is carrying the entire financial weight of this marriage on his shoulders. A real man shouldn't have to worry about every dollar while his wife sits at home reading novels." I set down the tray of fresh tea I had just poured. "Victoria, I manage the firm's administrative files, handle the house, and ensure Julian's overhead remains low. That isn't sitting around." Victoria let out a soft, mocking chuckle, taking a delicate sip of tea. "Oh, honey, managing a grocery list isn't real labor. You haven't earned a single paycheck in over a decade. If Julian didn't provide for you out of his own generosity, where would you be?" Before I could answer, the front door clicked open. Julian walked into the kitchen, loosening his silk tie, his face worn thin with stress. He barely glanced at me before leaning down to kiss his mother's cheek. "Julian, sweetheart," Victoria purred, adjusting his collar. "I was just reminding Audrey how hard you work to support her lifestyle. Perhaps you should tighten her credit card limit this month. Every dollar counts toward your new commercial expansion." I waited for my husband to defend me. I waited for him to mention the nights I stayed up until 2 a.m. organizing his tax receipts or the clients I entertained. Instead, Julian pulled a cold bottle of sparkling water from the refrigerator and gave me a sharp, dismissive glare. "Mom is right, Audrey," Julian said, his tone flat and unyielding. "You don't understand the pressures of running a real business. Money doesn't grow on trees, and frankly, your spending on household decor and organic groceries has been getting out of hand. From now on, any expense over $50 needs my personal approval." I stood there in my own kitchen, surrounded by the home I had built with my bare hands, feeling completely invisible. They looked at me as if I were a parasite living off Julian's hard work. They had no idea that while they were busy belittling my worth, my life was about to change forever. 3 weeks after that degrading afternoon in my own kitchen, my entire world shattered. My mother, Evelyn Miller, a fiercely independent retired teacher who lived in a small, sunlit cottage in northern Colorado, passed away suddenly from a massive stroke. She was my rock, my confidant, and the only person who saw through Julian's polished facade and Victoria's snobbish arrogance. During the 4 agonizing days I spent in my hometown arranging her funeral, neither Julian nor his mother bothered to attend the service. Julian sent a brief text citing an urgent client meeting, while Victoria merely emailed a generic condolence card. On the morning after the burial, I sat in the oak-paneled office of Arthur Fairchild, my mother's lifelong estate attorney. Arthur was as a distinguished man in his late 60s with silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a calming presence that offered a small island of comfort in my sea of grief. "Audrey, your mother loved you more than life itself," Arthur said softly, resting his hands on a thick manila folder stamped with a red seal. "She knew the sacrifices you made for your marriage, but she also worried about your financial independence. She was very perceptive." Arthur opened the folder and pushed a certified legal document across the mahogany desk toward me. 6 years ago, after selling her family land in Texas, Arthur explained, your mother established a irrevocable private trust account under your sole name and social security number at First National Bank of Denver. She quietly funded it over the years through conservative index investments and real estate dividends. I stared at the black and white ledger statement on top of the stack. My breath hitched in my throat as my eyes locked onto the final balance figure highlighted in dark yellow ink. $500,000. $500,000? I whispered, my voice trembling as tears welled in my eyes. She never mentioned a dime of this to me. She explicitly instructed me to hold all documentation until her passing, Arthur said, leaning forward with a stern, protective expression. This money was designed as your safety net, Audrey. It is completely separate from your marital assets. It bears your sole signature. Julian has no legal claim to it, no access to it, and under Colorado probate laws, it cannot be considered community property unless you voluntarily commingle it with a joint bank account. A wave of overwhelming gratitude washed over me, instantly followed by a deep sense of relief. For 12 years, I had lived under the suffocating fear of what would happen to me if my marriage crumbled, if the man who treated me like an unpaid servant decided to cast me aside. My mother had given me a lifeline, a ticket back to my own identity and dignity. I carefully gathered the original trust certificates, bank access keys, and account routing information, placing them inside a heavy leather binder. When I drove back to Denver late that evening, the house was dark and silent. Julian was asleep in the master bedroom, leaving behind 2 empty wine glasses in the sink. I didn't bring the leather binder into our bedroom. Instead, I walked down the hall to my private home office, the small, sun-drenched room where I handled graphic design projects before my marriage. I pulled out my fireproof personal safe hidden behind the lower bookcase shelf, unlocked it with a key I kept on my necklace, and slipped my mother's trust documents inside. Setting the combination dial back to 0, I felt a quiet, cool strength settle over my chest. For the first time in over a decade, I didn't plan on throwing the money in Julian's face or using it to buy frivolous luxuries. It was my mother's final gift of freedom, a silent armor I would wear until I decided what my future looked like. For 3 weeks after my mother's funeral, a deceptive calm settled over the house. I returned to my daily routine, cooking meals, managing invoices, and running errands, but internally, everything had shifted. Knowing I had $500,000 secured in my mother's private trust gave me a quiet composure that Julian clearly noticed. He seemed agitated by my lack of reaction to his constant complaints about money, but he was far too self-absorbed to investigate why I suddenly stopped walking on eggshells around him. What I didn't know was that while I was grieving, Julian's world was crumbling to pieces behind closed doors. His architectural firm, Sterling Designs, was bleeding cash. A high-risk commercial development project in downtown Denver had stalled after a major investor pulled out, leaving Julian with over $400,000 in unpaid contractor debts, bank loan interest, and overdue payroll. He was facing immediate public bankruptcy, the collapse of his professional reputation, and the loss of our suburban home. It was Victoria who came up with the sinister solution. One rainy afternoon, while I was out purchasing groceries at the local supermarket, Victoria came over to the house. She had learned about my mother's passing and knew from town gossip that my mother's estate had been settled swiftly. Knowing my mother's prudent financial habits, Victoria suspected there was a substantial inheritance left behind. "Julian, stop acting so hopeless," Victoria insisted, her sharp voice echoing through the quiet foyer as she slammed her leather handbag onto the counter. Evelyn Miller wasn't a pauper. She owned real estate and stocks. Audrey must have the probate paperwork hidden in this house. "Mom, I can't just ask her for money," Julian argued defensively, though his voice lacked conviction. "She's still mourning her mother, and besides, if it's a private trust, it's not legally mine." "Don't be a fool," Victoria snapped, grabbing her son by his lapels. "You supported that girl for 12 years. She owes you every breath she takes in this house. If your firm goes under, everything we built is gone. Find her estate documents. Marcus can help us handle the rest." Marcus Hayes was Julian's college roommate and closest confidant, a shady financial consultant who held an official notary commission in Colorado. Marcus was drowning in his own personal gambling debts and was more than willing to bend the law for a cut of the profits. Desperate and morally bankrupt, Julian didn't hesitate. While I was stuck in heavy Friday evening traffic on the interstate, Julian went into my home office. He pulled away the lower bookcase shelf, revealed my personal fireproof safe, and used a crowbar from his garage workbench to pry open the heavy steel latch. Inside, he found the binder. He didn't just find my mother's trust documents. He found the full bank routing numbers, my social security details, and certified copies of my mother's death certificate. Instead of feeling guilt, Julian felt a rush of greedy exhilaration. He called Marcus immediately. Within 2 hours, Marcus drafted a fraudulent, high-priority durable power of attorney document. Using a forged copy of my signature that Julian copied from our joint tax returns, Marcus affixed his official notary seal and stamped to the affidavit, fraudulently testifying that I had appeared before him in person to grant Julian full, unrestricted access to my financial accounts. By 5 o'clock that evening, while I was carefully putting away groceries in our kitchen, Julian was standing at the drive-through wire window of First National Bank of Denver. He handed over the forged power of attorney and initiated a complete, emergency liquidation wire transfer. All $500,000 were transferred out of my mother's trust account and deposited directly into the primary operating account of Sterling Designs. When I walked into my home office late that evening to file my grocery receipts, my blood ran cold. The lower wooden bookcase panel had been ripped off its hinges, splintered oak lying scattered across the hardwood floor like bone fragments. My fireproof safe was resting lopsided on my desk, its steel locking mechanism mangled and forced open with heavy tools. I rushed forward, my hands trembling violently as I looked inside. The binder was gone. My mother's trust certificates, her death certificate, and the bank routing documents had been completely stripped from the vault. Panic surging through my veins, I immediately opened my banking application on my phone, logging into the secure portal for my mother's trust at First National Bank of Denver. The red bold numbers on the screen hit me like a physical blow. Current balance $. A wire transfer confirmation time-stamped at 4:52 p.m. showed that $500,000 had been cleared and routed into an account ending in 8802, the corporate account of Sterling Designs. My lungs seized. The money my mother had spent her entire life saving to protect me was gone in a single afternoon. I grabbed my phone, clutching it so tightly my knuckles turned white, and marched straight down the carpeted hallway, toward the dining room. Julian and Victoria were sitting at the formal mahogany table, uncorking a bottle of vintage Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon. They were laughing loudly, clinking their crystal glasses together in a joyful toast, surrounded by expensive takeout boxes from a high-end steakhouse downtown. They didn't look like people who had just committed a crime, they looked like winners celebrating a championship. "Julian," I rasped, my voice shaking with a dangerous mixture of absolute betrayal and blinding rage. "What did you do to my office?" Julian set his wine glass down calmly, wiping his lips with a linen napkin, an insufferable, smug smirk stretching across his handsome face. He didn't even bother to look ashamed. "Oh, settle down, Audrey," Julian said smoothly, leaning back in his leather chair. "I borrowed your trust documentation. I had to handle an urgent business restructuring for the firm." "You broke into my private safe," I shouted, stepping toward the table, slamming my hands onto the wood. "You stole $500,000. That money belonged to my mother. It was in a private account under my sole name." "Technically, darling," Victoria chimed in, cutting a slice of prime rib with a sharp silver knife. "You are married to my son. In a proper household, a wife doesn't hoard $500,000 in secret while her husband works himself to the bone to keep a roof over her head." "It was a private inheritance, Victoria," I yelled, turning my gaze onto my mother-in-law. "It wasn't a joint asset. Julian had no legal right to touch a single penny." "I am the head of this household, Audrey," Julian declared, his voice dropping into a stern, controlling register as he stood up to face me. Sterling Designs was facing a temporary liquidity crunch. "I used your inheritance as a capital injection to clear our vendor debts and secure a massive commercial contract. I saved this family from embarrassment." "You forged my signature, Julian," I whispered, my voice dropping an octave, becoming cold and razor-sharp. "There is no legal way you could have wired that money without my consent, unless you committed fraud." "Good luck proving that," Julian sneered, stepping closer and looming over me with cold condescension. Marcus validated the authorization paperwork with his official state notary seal. "As far as the bank is concerned, everything was signed, sealed, and delivered by you." "You don't know anything about finance, Audrey. You're just a housewife. So sit down, drink a glass of wine, and be grateful that I'm smart enough to turn your mother's dead money into a thriving business." I looked at my husband and his mother, taking in their arrogant smiles and utter lack of remorse. I didn't scream, I didn't cry. I simply turned around and walked out of the room. I didn't say another word to Julian or Victoria. Arguing with two narcissists who felt entitled to my mother's life savings was a complete waste of energy. I walked upstairs to our master bedroom, locked the door behind me, and pulled my leather carry-on suitcase out of the closet. I moved with quiet, methodical precision. I packed 5 days' worth of practical clothing, my laptop, my passport, my birth certificate, and my tax records from before our marriage. I made sure to take my mother's small pearl necklace from my jewelry box, the last physical piece of her I had left. Downstairs, I could hear Julian and Victoria opening a second bottle of wine, their muffled laughter floating up through the floorboards. They truly believed I was upstairs crying into my pillow, preparing to accept my fate like a helpless, obedient victim. They had no idea that my silence wasn't surrender. It was the quiet before a firestorm. By 11:30 p.m., the house was completely dark and quiet. Julian was snoring heavily on the living room sofa, passed out from the steak and wine, while Victoria had retired to the guest bedroom. I slipped down the stairs, carrying my suitcase in one hand and my shoes in the other. I unlocked the front door, stepped out into the crisp Denver night air, and got into my Subaru. I didn't turn on the engine until I had coasted the car to the end of the block. As I drove away, watching the dark silhouette of our suburban house vanish in my rearview mirror, a cold, unwavering determination took root in my soul. I checked into a quiet, extended-stay hotel near downtown Denver, paid cash for a week, and spent the remaining hours of the night organizing my thoughts. At 8:00 a.m. sharp the next morning, I stood outside the prestigious law offices of Fairchild, Sterling and Associates. Arthur Fairchild was waiting for me in his corner office, overlooking the city skyline, a steaming mug of black coffee in his hand. When I placed my damaged phone on his mahogany desk and showed him the $0 balance alert alongside the $500,000 transfer notification to Sterling Designs, the seasoned attorney's friendly expression vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, lethal professionalism. "He cleared the entire account?" Arthur asked, his brow furrowing as he reviewed the digital transaction logs. "He broke into my fireproof safe while I was out buying groceries," I explained, my voice steady, calm, and filled with an iron resolve. "He claims his friend, Marcus Hayes, notarized a power of attorney form authorizing him to liquidate the trust." Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, tapping his fountain pen against his desk. "Marcus Hayes is a registered notary public in the state of Colorado. Under Revised Statute 24-21-501, a notary public who executes a fraudulent verification or certifies a signature without the principal physically present commits a Class II misdemeanor alongside severe civil liability." "It gets worse, Arthur," I said, leaning forward. "The money wasn't just moved between personal accounts. It was wired directly into Julian's commercial operating account to pay off corporate creditors across state lines." Arthur's eyes narrowed behind his wire-rimmed glasses, a sharp, cold smile spreading across his face. "Transfers exceeding $500,000 executed across state lines using fraudulent notarization and forged documentation do not fall under simple domestic asset disputes, Audrey," Arthur said, pulling a fresh legal pad toward him. "That is a textbook violation of federal law under 18 U.S. Code Section 1343, felony wire fraud." Arthur picked up his desk phone, dialed a direct extension, and pressed the speaker button. "Get me Special Agent Miller at the Denver FBI Financial Crimes Division," Arthur instructed his assistant coldly. "We have a major bank fraud case ready for immediate indictment." By 2:00 p.m., I was sitting in a high-floor conference room inside the federal building in downtown Denver. The glass-walled room overlooked the snow-capped peaks of the Rockies, but inside, the atmosphere was sterile and intense. Sitting across the polished oak table was Special Agent Miller, a sharp, methodical investigator in his early 50s, with steel-gray hair and an immaculate navy suit alongside two forensic accountants from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Arthur sat beside me, his thick leather briefcase open, laying out our strategy with surgical precision. "Walk us through the exact sequence of events, Mrs. Sterling," Agent Miller said, opening a navy blue official folder and clicking his pen. "Starting from the moment you left your residence yesterday afternoon." I didn't stutter, cry, or exaggerate. For 40 minutes, I laid out a cold, chronological timeline. I provided grocery store receipts with exact electronic timestamps, proving I was 5 miles away at the precise moment Julian initiated the transaction. I provided my mother's original trust mandate, explicitly stating that the funds were sole, non-marital property. Then Arthur produced our trump card. He slid a tablet across the table to Agent Miller. "This is the high-definition security camera footage from the drive-through wire teller window at First National Bank of Denver, recorded it at 5:50 p.m. yesterday." Agent Miller pressed play. The video was crystal clear. It showed Julian sitting in his luxury SUV, leaning out the window, handing over the fraudulent power of attorney document. Sitting right beside him in the passenger seat was Marcus Hayes, holding his official notary stamp, an ink pad, stamping the paper right on the vehicle's dashboard seconds before handing it to the bank teller. Agent Miller let out a low, disbelieving whistle, leaning closer to the screen. He stamped a legal affidavit on a car dashboard without the principal party present? Not only that, Agent Miller, Arthur interjected, placing a second document on the table. Here is the corporate ledger for Sterling Designs. Within 90 minutes of the wire clearing, Julian transferred $200,000 to an offshore commercial vendor in Delaware and drafted a $50,000 cashier's check directly to Marcus Hayes as a consulting fee. Agent Miller closed the folder with a sharp, decisive thud that echoed off the glass walls. "Mrs. Sterling," Agent Miller said, looking directly into my eyes with grave seriousness, "your husband didn't just commit a civil breach. By using interstate wire systems to transfer stolen, forged funds to an offshore entity, he crossed straight into federal territory. Under Title 18 of the United States Code, this constitutes grand identity theft, bank fraud, and felony wire fraud." "What happens next?" I asked, my voice steady and unyielding. "We are issuing an emergency federal freeze on every corporate and personal account linked to Sterling Designs, Marcus Hayes, and Julian Sterling within the hour," Agent Miller declared, standing up. "Furthermore, because Mr. Sterling is hosting a high-profile corporate relaunch gala tomorrow evening at the Grand Hyatt at downtown to announce his new commercial expansion, we will coordinate with the United States Marshals Service to execute federal arrest warrants." Arthur turned to me with a calm, triumphant smile. "Julian thinks he used your mother's money to buy his salvation, Audrey. In reality, he just paid for his own federal indictment." I looked out the window at the distant mountains, feeling a profound sense of justice washing over me. Julian and Victoria had spent 12 years treating me like a helpless, disposable ghost in my own home. They believed I was too weak, too uneducated, and too timid to fight back. They were about to learn that taking my mother's legacy was the absolute worst mistake of their lives. At 7 o'clock on Saturday evening, the grand ballroom of the Grand Hyatt Denver was bathed in warm golden light, smelling of fresh white lilies and expensive champagne. Julian had spared no expense with my mother's stolen money. Over 200 guests, downtown real estate developers, city council members, wealthy investors, and prominent local journalists milled about in formal black tie attire, sipping vintage Prosecco and eating lobster hors d'oeuvres. Giant silk banners draped from the crystal chandeliers, bearing the sleek silver logo of Sterling Designs alongside the bold headline, "A New Era of Architectural Excellence." Standing on the raised VIP platform near the stage, Julian looked like a man at the absolute peak of his life. He wore a brand-new tailored Tom Ford tuxedo, holding a glass of champagne, laughing loudly with two high-profile commercial land brokers. Beside him stood Victoria, draped in a floor-length emerald silk gown and wearing an antique diamond necklace, glowing with smug satisfaction as she accepted congratulations from wealthy socialites. They were convinced they had won. They thought I was sitting in a cheap motel room weeping over my shattered life, while they used my stolen legacy to cement their high society status. They had no idea that 4 federal agents in dark suits were currently standing at the back entrance of the ballroom, holding a signed warrant from a United States District Judge. I arrived at 7:30 p.m. I didn't sneak into the ballroom through the service doors, and I didn't hide in the shadows. I walked through the double oak doors in a striking, floor-length midnight blue silk dress, my hair styled in an elegant chignon, wearing my mother's small pearl necklace. Arthur Fairchild walked beside me, his dignified presence adding an aura of cold, undeniable authority. As I glided across the polished marble floor toward the VIP platform, conversations slowed. People turned to look, murmuring among themselves. For 12 years, these people had known me as Julian's quiet, plain, stay-at-home wife who served drinks at dinner parties and stayed out of the way. Tonight, I moved with the unshakable confidence of a woman who owned her own destiny. Julian caught sight of me first. His smug smile wavered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of irritation crossing his handsome features, before his arrogant composure took over once more. He set his champagne glass down and stepped off the platform, blocking my path with a condescending smirk. "Audrey?" Julian said, his voice dripping with smooth, controlled contempt. "What on earth are you doing here? I thought I made it clear that tonight is for serious business professionals. You look ridiculous, causing a scene." Victoria hurried down the steps behind him, fanning herself with a velvet program, her eyes flashing with pure venom. "Audrey, leave immediately," Victoria hissed under her breath, glaring at my silk dress. "How dare you embarrass my son in front of his investors? You belong at home, not ruining an important event for people who actually work for a living." I stood my ground, looking Julian straight in his cold blue eyes. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flinch. "I'm not here to ruin your party, Julian," I said, my voice echoing clearly over the soft jazz music playing in the background. "I'm here to watch you pay for it." Julian let out a harsh, arrogant laugh, adjusting his cufflinks. "Pay for it? With what? Your dead mother's money. Get out of here before I have hotel security escort you to the street." "Hotel security won't be necessary, Mr. Sterling," a deep, booming voice announced from behind him. Julian's smirk froze. Victoria gasped, dropping her velvet program onto the marble floor. Special Agent Miller stepped out from behind the velvet entryway curtains, flanked by 3 uniformed United States Marshals and 2 officers from the Denver Police Department. The soft background jazz music cut off abruptly as the hotel security staff backed away, allowing the federal agents to form a tight, impenetrable perimeter around the VIP platform. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the massive ballroom. 200 wealthy investors, city officials, and journalists froze in place, their champagne glasses suspended mid-air as all eyes locked onto my husband. Julian's face drained of every ounce of color, turning a sickly, ghostly gray. "What is the meaning of this?" Julian demanded, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, desperate tremor as he tried to maintain his arrogant posture. "I am Julian Sterling. This is a private corporate gala. You can't just barge in here." Agent Miller pulled a crisp, white document stamped with a golden federal seal from inside his breast pocket, holding it directly in front of Julian's face. "Julian Sterling," Agent Miller announced, his booming voice carrying across the silent hall, echoing off the high, gilded ceilings. "You are under arrest pursuant to an emergency warrant issued by the United States District Court for the District of Colorado. You are charged with Class B felony bank fraud, identity theft, and federal wire fraud under Title 18 of the United States Code." A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the crowd. Cameras began flashing instantly as several local news reporters pulled out their smartphones, recording every single second of the public humiliation. "That's absurd," Victoria shrieked, her voice turning into a piercing, hysterical screech as she grabbed recklessly at Agent Miller's arm. "This is outrageous misunderstanding. My son didn't commit fraud. His wife gave him that money. Audrey, tell them you authorized the transfer." I stepped forward, meeting Victoria's frantic, wild gaze with absolute icy calm. I never signed a single paper, Victoria, I said, my voice loud, clear, and steady enough for every guest in the front rows to hear. Your son broke into my home office, stole my mother's private trust binder, and paid his crooked friend Marcus Hayes to forge my signature on a fake power of attorney. At that exact moment, 2 federal marshals stepped up from the side stairs, escorting a pale, sweating Marcus Hayes in handcuffs. Marcus refused to look at Julian, staring down at the floor in utter disgrace. Marcus? Julian whispered, his knees visibly trembling inside his tailored trousers. What did you do? He confessed 20 minutes ago, Mr. Sterling, Agent Miller replied coldly. And 5 minutes ago, federal authorities executed a complete freeze on every corporate account linked to Sterling Designs, alongside your personal assets. Before Julian could utter another word, the lead marshal grabbed his wrists, pulled them sharply behind his back, and snapped heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists with 2 loud, metallic clicks. You can't do this to my son. Victoria screamed, her emerald silk dress tangling around her legs, as she stumbled backward against the platform railing, clutching her chest, sobbing uncontrollably as her high society status shattered into worthless dust right in front of her peers. Eleni, me and Audrey, you ruined us. You monster. I didn't answer her. I didn't yell, I didn't gloat, and I didn't shed a single tear. I simply stood beside Arthur, holding my head high, as the marshals escorted my handcuffed husband and his accomplice past his speechless investors, out through the grand double doors, and straight into the waiting police cruisers waiting in the pouring rain outside. The federal courtroom in downtown Denver was stark cold and smelled faintly of floor polish and aged leather. At 9 a.m., on a crisp Tuesday morning 3 months after the gala, I sat at the prosecution's table alongside Arthur Fairchild and the Assistant United States Attorney. Behind us sat 2 rows of local press and curious observers, but on the defense side, the chairs were nearly empty. Julian sat at the defendant's table wearing a navy blue prison jumpsuit over a gray thermal shirt. His polished, athletic frame had withered after weeks in federal holding. His hair was unkempt, his jaw unshaven, and his shoulders slouched in a posture of complete, irreversible defeat. Sitting behind him in the gallery was Victoria, wearing a faded coat, her former arrogant posture completely deflated as she clutched a crumpled tissue in her shaking hands. Judge Margaret Harrison, a stern woman in her late 60s known for her uncompromising stance against white-collar financial crimes, struck her heavy oak gavel against the sound block. Case number 26 CR IOR 4412, Judge Harrison announced, her crisp voice echoing against the high plaster ceilings. The United States versus Julian Sterling and Marcus Hayes, entering formal plea agreements. The prosecutor stood up, adjusting his dark tie. Your Honor, the defendants have agreed to enter guilty pleas to reduced counts of federal wire fraud and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. Under the negotiated terms, defendant Marcus Hayes will surrender his notary commission permanently and serve 2 years in federal custody. Defendant Julian Sterling will serve 48 months in a federal penitentiary. Julian's public defender stood up quickly. Your Honor, my client is a first-time offender who operated under extreme financial distress. We ask the court to approve the recommended plea and order immediate liquidation of corporate holdings for full victim restitution. Judge Harrison lowered her reading glasses, looking over the bench directly at Julian with piercing, icy blue eyes. Mr. Sterling, Judge Harrison said, her tone dripping with quiet fury. You didn't just breach a contract, you violated the sacred trust of your marriage, broke into your wife's private safe while she grieved her mother, and used forged legal documents to plunder her inheritance. That is not business distress, That is pure, unadulterated greed. Judge Harrison brought her gavel down hard with a loud, final thud. Plea accepted. Defendant Julian Sterling is sentenced to 48 months in federal custody, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The court orders the immediate, unencumbered transfer of $500,000 from seized corporate assets directly back to the victim, Audrey Miller. A choked, hysterical sob broke out from the gallery as Victoria buried her face in her hands. Outside the courtroom doors 20 minutes later, Victoria intercepted me near the elevators. Her face was pale, her voice trembling with desperate, pathetic anger as she reached out toward me. "Audrey, please." Victoria wept, her voice echoing down the marble hallway. "You got your money back. Tell the judge you want to drop the charges. Julian won't survive 4 years in a federal prison. He's delicate." I pulled my arm out of her reach, stepping back into the bright sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "I didn't put Julian in prison, Victoria," I said, my voice dead calm and entirely free of anger. "His own greed put him there, and for 12 years, you enabled every bit of it." "We have nothing left," Victoria wailed, her former high society dignity completely dissolved into desperate begging. "The bank is foreclosing on the house. The company is bankrupt. I had to sell my jewelry just to pay his legal retainers." I looked at my mother-in-law, remembering how she had sat in my kitchen 3 months ago, telling me I was worthless and didn't deserve a single dollar. "Then I suggest you learn how to live on a budget, Victoria," I replied quietly. "Because nobody is coming to support you." 6 months after the heavy iron doors of Englewood Federal Correctional Institution closed behind Julian, the morning sun broke through the autumn mist over downtown Denver, painting the glass skyscrapers in warm shades of amber and rose. The crisp Colorado air smelled of pine, roasted coffee beans, and fresh fallen leaves as I stood on the private balcony of my new loft apartment in the historic Pearl District. The high-ceilinged space was flooded with natural light, filled with lush green houseplants, drafting tables, and canvas prints of my latest creative projects. It was quiet, peaceful, and entirely mine. My divorce from Julian had been finalized 2 months ago with swift, surgical efficiency. Because Julian had committed intentional, criminal fraud against our marital estate, the family court judge ruled that he had forfeited all claims to equitable division. Every penny of my mother's $500,000 trust had been fully restored into my private, court-monitored account at First National Bank of Denver. Furthermore, the court awarded me the remaining net equity from the sale of our suburban house, allowing me to completely clear my legal fees and start fresh without a single dollar of debt. I used a portion of my capital to re-establish my creative career, launching Miller Design Studio, a boutique branding agency catering to women-owned businesses across the Pacific Northwest. Within 4 months, I had hired 2 talented young graphic designers and signed contracts with 3 major regional clients. As for Julian and Victoria, the house of cards they had built on arrogance and stolen money had collapsed into complete ruin. Julian was currently serving his 4-year sentence at a federal prison facility, spending 12 hours a day working in the prison laundry room to pay off his court-ordered restitution fines. Marcus Hayes had lost his notary license permanently and was serving 2 years in state custody. Deprived of her son's income and stripped of her social standing, Victoria was forced to sell her luxury wardrobe to move into a tiny, 1-bedroom rental apartment on the outskirts of the city, surviving on a meager fixed Social Security check and her own bitter memories. My phone chimed on the granite kitchen counter, interrupting my thoughts. I walked inside and picked it up, smiling as I saw a calendar notification from Arthur Fairchild. Trust disbursement approved, Miller Foundation for Financial Literacy. I had set aside $50,000 from my mother's legacy to establish a nonprofit foundation providing free legal advice, financial education, and emergency grants for stay-at-home mothers escaping financially abusive marriages. My mother had saved me. Now, her legacy would save dozens of other women who felt trapped in the shadows of their own homes. I poured a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, walked over to my drafting desk, and picked up a framed photograph of my mother sitting in her sunlit garden. Her warm, wise eyes seemed to smile back at me through the glass. "We did it, Mom," I whispered softly, pressing my fingers gently against the glass frame. "Your legacy is safe." Looking out over the bustling city streets below, I felt a deep, unshakable sense of freedom settling into my bones. For 12 long years, I had allowed myself to be defined by a man who measured my worth in dollars and domestic submission. I had lived as a ghost in my own life, quiet and invisible. But as I stepped out into the morning sunshine toward my new studio, heading to my first client